So I think we are at an evolutionary point in our human story where we are moving individually from a sort of dominant mode maybe of competition. I guess that's the dominant mode in the economic sphere, we would say, to one that's more inclined toward cooperation and relationality, relationship-oriented interactions in our economic sphere. And collectively, I think we're evolving from a sort of focus on specialization and separation to one of more kind of intersectional thinking and interdependency or interconnectedness. And so I think a lot in my life's work about where we see evidence of those shifts in the world of business and economics. So I started out thinking about the role of business as a force for good in the world. And over the last few decades in particular, we see everyone from large corporate leaders to business schools thinking about how business can be harnessed to solve social problems, create public good, create shared value. So the idea is to use capital and market forces to create access to capital for those that might not otherwise have access to that capital, to start businesses, to create livelihoods, to strengthen their neighborhoods and their communities. So I started working in that space in the United States, and mostly with immigrant entrepreneurs across this country who didn't have access to traditional commercial finance as we knew it. And in that process, I started to think a lot about how we could leverage the assets of, in particular, the business community and capitalism to create a more vibrant civic life for people. And so in that process, I worked with many corporations who wanted to, as an expression of social responsibility, start to create programs that could help those in the community, could help local businesses. So we created small loan funds inside of different corporations, and then actually had those business leaders coach small business entrepreneurs in the community. So it was a really interesting way of saying, as a big business, as a successful company, sure, we have financial capital that we can bring to bear on this problem. We also have our unique intellectual assets, our unique expertise, and we can help bring that to the community as well. From there, I started to think about how business could actually work in close concert with our public institutions, with governments. So fast forward to Michigan, not too long following the economic recession, and the state, in particular, Detroit. Everyone knows the Detroit story. Detroit was featured on the cover of magazines as the apocalyptic city of the year. And I thought, well, there has to be a different narrative here. There has to be a way that we can think about, again, creating broadly shared prosperity and flourishing for all. And so in close partnership with the state government, the state's Economic Development Corporation, we developed a way of crowdsourcing business models and ideas to help solve public problems, the most important of which was chronic unemployment, people who had been laid off in the workforce and were not able to get back into their jobs. So we looked at how entrepreneurs around the state could help solve that problem, help create more opportunity. And it was really successful. 650 businesses around the state actually ended up working in partnership with the government and other local foundations and corporations that supported this program to help solve that problem. I would call it a little bit of an experiment that is about inviting love into the economic domain. And that's an experiment that is called the economy of communion. One area where we see some encouraging developments in this space is in the field that I work in, which is the field of impact investing. So impact investing means different things to different people. But broadly, it's about harnessing capital and making investments that generate, alongside some sort of financial return, also generate measurable social impact. And the increasing number of funds, funders, private banks, and private foundations alike, increasing number that are interested in this space is really forcing a conversation about how we measure not just the financial bottom line of a company or an investee, but how they are moving the needle on a social problem. that they care about and how they are impacting communities of color or low-income communities in ways intended and unintended. So we need to have this accountability in place. We need to be able to measure what it is that our businesses are doing in communities, and in so doing, have honest conversations about whether we're making the intended impact we want to have, if we need to shift course, and how you invite investors and funders and other stakeholders into that conversation is very important. And so I'm encouraged by the field of impact investing. I think it's the future of finance. I think investors are going to want to see what their capital is delivering well beyond strictly a financial return in the world. The economy of communion is a network, a global network of about 850 small and medium-sized businesses. And the challenge that they are consistently grappling with is how to show that it's possible for love to be the driving and animating force of economic decision-making. And the network was actually started in 1991 in Brazil when the founder of a lay ecclesial movement called Focolare visited a community of people in Sao Paulo, Brazil, that were involved with this network. And there she saw this really sharp contrast between the haves and the have-nots. The skyscrapers existing right alongside the favelas of Sao Paulo, Brazil. And struck by that sharp contrast of wealth and the poor allocation of resources across that community, she started to ask herself about strategies to create wealth that could be shared and distributed differently, to create a community of people that knew each other well, that cared deeply for each other, knew what each other's needs were, and shared their resources accordingly. And so out of that inspiration was launched this network that we call the Economy of Communion. And it still exists today and is thriving in different parts of the globe. And the idea with the Economy of Communion is for entrepreneurs to build businesses that really that generate profits and wealth like any successful business, but those profits have three destinations. So the first is certainly to invest in the growth and development of the company in order for it to be successful in today's market economy. The second is to actually think about distributing those profits, sharing those profits broadly to meet the needs of people in the community. And the third is to invest in education and formation and training for individuals all around the globe who are interested in thinking about love as the center of their business and economic decision-making. How do you take the human person and make that the center of how you build a company, how you conduct all of your business affairs, your interactions with your customers, your suppliers, your employees, et cetera? How does that become the sort of ethos of how you build and run a company? The word communion, as we understand it in this effort, in this initiative, is pretty closely equated with the idea of reciprocity. And reciprocity could be defined as a sort of genuine concern for the well-being of others, of the other, that's not non-conditional and non-instrumental. So when we think about economic transactions or business transactions, the default or sort of still the dominant paradigm in our economic theory is the homo economicus, right? It's the idea of the self-interested, rational actor that's utility maximizing. And I'm a student of economics. I studied economics as an undergraduate and a graduate student and was actually pretty dissatisfied with this archetype of the homo economicus. That's what prompted me to start to look at research and work with groups that were kind of challenging that dominant paradigm and asking this question of, well, what if we looked at someone as a multidimensional person that wasn't entirely self-seeking or self-interested, but was really also relational and interested in building community and being a part of community as their whole selves. So the economy of communion really drew my attention because this idea of communion or reciprocity in business and in the workplace acknowledges that people come to you with all sorts of different contributions and all sorts of different needs. And if you're going to have this exchange that's not purely instrumental, not purely transactional, but a mutually enriching exchange in the economy, you need someone who has something to offer. It's a product, it's a service, it's capital, et cetera. And you need someone who has a need that they bring to that interaction as well. And so if you value that need as equally important and necessary for that mutually enriching interaction, that shifts the whole idea of what we would see as kind of more of a paternalistic view on the economy and on how business affairs are conducted, right? It shifts the power dynamic, shifts the hierarchy. So I think that has all sorts of implications in terms of how a business is embedded within its community, the kinds of relationships it builds with its suppliers, with the people who clean the building, with the people who come, the customers who come to get a product or service, and certainly with employees. So we know that life is messy, and there are all sorts of things that interfere in our lives that make it such that we are not perfectly utility maximizing at any all the time. And that actually, in the economy of communion, the idea would be that you would see the dignity of the human person first and foremost, and you would try to meet them where they're at and help understand, well, what can they really bring to the table here, and what can we really do to help them continue to grow and develop. If you go a step further and you start with thinking about what's good for the human person as opposed to what's good for my bottom line, that from that will flow what you need to do good business. Many years ago, I studied business social responsibility movements and workplace democracy strategies. And all of those things point toward this idea that that our businesses better reflect the needs of our customers, our broader community, and internal stakeholders better when we have collective decision-making processes, right? When we can pull on the intelligence and the awareness and the needs of everyone involved with the business. So this idea of community inside business is not new. What we need to do is we need to push the boundary. We need to go from we do this because this is good for business. We need to move from that to we do this because this is who we are. We are built to be in relationship. And we spend a significant amount of our lives in our workplaces. I mean, many, many hours, right? So how can our workplaces become spaces for our own human growth and development, right? How can they become places where we really develop and flourish? And I think a lot of business leaders are asking that question. How do I create an environment where people can in freedom, sort of grow and develop their talents and build relationship? And economy of communion entrepreneurs do that through really small and intentional actions and decisions. So for example, some of the companies here in the United States make a point to, when someone is going through a crisis at home, to make a point to create the flexibility required to allow them to attend to what they need to, while also continuing on with their job and responsibilities, and then pulling upon the whole of the community within the workplace to make sure that that person is supported in the way that they need. Or for example, I know one economy of communion entrepreneur, an environmental consulting business, had a janitor that had been working for them for a number of years. And in getting to know that person and building a relationship with her, they understood that she had a lifelong dream of opening a daycare and didn't have access to the capital or the means to do it. And so they provided her with a microloan, an interest-free loan, so she could launch that. And they did lose her as a janitor eventually, but she went on to pursue her goals and her dreams. And in the process was able to contribute back to them, right? To bring her network to bear, and certainly in meeting the needs of the company. So I think those are really beautiful sort of stories that for me embody what relationship really looks like, right? That reciprocity, that genuine care and concern for the other. So rather than the sort of traditional corporate charter of I do this to enrich my shareholders, I'm actually thinking about stakeholders outside of my investor circle, my shareholders, and making decisions with them in mind. And I'm thinking about creating value for those many different types of stakeholders with every decision. What we need now in society is we need new structures and new incentives to foster, encourage, and support that kind of behavior. So we see a little bit of evidence of that with the advent of the benefit corporation, for example, a new legal structure that would literally allow business leaders to say in their corporate charter, my sole mission is not strictly to maximize shareholder wealth. I'm actually also maximizing on mission here. I'm maximizing on a social good that I have set out to articulate as a business entrepreneur. We need to imagine new ways of forming businesses and companies that allow for this kind of new decision-making to take place. We are not necessarily homo economicus actors walking around making self-interested decisions. If we fail to cultivate different kinds of biases in our decision-making that are inclined toward relationship building, care, and concern for the other, then we will fall short of our potential as far as our own good and development is concerned as a society. That's what I believe. The advent of behavioral economics is an interesting shift in the field of economics because it acknowledges, through scholars like Daniel Kahneman and others, behavioral economists acknowledge that we are actually pretty complex in how we make business and economic decisions. We have a set of biases that we bring to the table in terms of how we think about those interactions and those decisions. So I guess the question that I've been sitting with really is, how do we cultivate a positive set of biases that really will contribute to the well-being of ourselves and others in the broader community? And we can't presuppose that we know how to do that until we are in relationship with the broader community. So what can we be doing through our business and economic structures to strengthen those civic ties, to actually help people understand better what it means to be concerned about the needs of the other, right? And so I really think that being in, again, it goes back to the centrality of being in relationship as very important in terms of helping us think about, well, what would it mean to appeal to our better angels as business and economic leaders? What would it mean to cultivate a set of biases that lead to a certain type of non-dominant decision-making in the marketplace? There's a thirst for the experience of the beloved community, which, as you mentioned, is mostly attributed to Martin Luther King and what he was able to cultivate in the civil rights movement. I think it's really interesting to hear people reflect on what they would, and when I think people express an interest in cultivating the beloved community, I think many times what they're saying is that they want to strengthen those ties, those bonds that really help us cultivate a common life that works for everyone. Because we recognize that those in power, especially those that have been able to harness our capitalist system toward their intended ends, that in so doing, others have been left out. That it hasn't been win-win historically. It's actually been win-lose, right? We've had a pretty dominant paradigm of competition in our capitalist system. And so when we bring in the concept of the beloved community, I think we're really interested in getting to this question of, how do we make this win-win? How does this become just as effective and meaningful and beneficial for you as it is for me? And so in organizations, we start to see the creation of maybe what are called affinity group, better termed as affinity groups than actual beloved communities. Because I think true beloved communities are characterized by a radical openness to something that's also different from who and what you are, in order to ensure that you're building genuine ties across various lines that we've drawn in society, racial lines, ethnic lines, economic, socioeconomic lines, etc. So one thing that is characteristic of true and authentic beloved communities, in my lived experience, is the presence of people who might not normally associate through the things that we churn through in our day-to-day lives, right? So how do you intentionally cultivate a community of people that really learn from each other as they're living with each other? Maybe it is a new kind of beloved community that we see in our organizations taking root. That idea of having sort of a networked set of people who are responsible for delivering value to customer or client. I really am encouraged by, especially over the last decade, the number of institutions, powerful institutions, that have taken a very democratic approach to solving problems through crowdsourcing methods and other ways of solving problems. So, for example, the United Nations, with their Sustainable Development Goals, decided, you know what, rather than issuing a sort of traditional RFP to request proposals for solutions that are aligned with our goals, why don't we assume that people are already solving these problems? People already care about these problems that we care about. And so let's put the call out to see who's working on what, who's already developing something. And in the process, generated thousands of proposals, thousands of existing solutions to meet the needs as articulated through the Sustainable Development Goals framework. How do we build a collaborative operating system inside of our organizations and outside? And in that experience, how are we building community, right? And how are we generating new kinds of beloved communities, actually? So as we think about how we might create space for and invite love in as a key animator of our business and economic decisions, I do think that we need to look to examples or communities like the economy of communion as both allies and kind of inspiration as we do that work. And I think that we need to trust in our capacities for collaboration and for mutual concern and reciprocity. There's an element of choice in this. So we may have an inclination toward a certain kind of behavior in our business and work and workplaces, but it's also something we have to cultivate. And I think we have to cultivate it at all levels. So if you're an entrepreneur, you're the head of a business institution, there are many things, and that's probably potentially more evident, more obvious, many things you could do to cultivate that kind of atmosphere. But at any level within an organization, you can be taking proactive steps to think about how to put the human person at the center of your work. And that begins with the colleague that's next to you at your desk, and certainly the people you're interacting with over the phone, the people you're serving through your business product and service, your end user for the product you're building, the software you're building, whatever it may be. How does that person become the centerpiece of your work? And how does that shift how you do your work? And how does it shift how you think about solving problems? Do you start to think of a more collaborative way of generating ideas, generating solutions, solving problems? I think we're on the cusp of this new way of thinking. I see evidence of it in a lot of different spaces and places, but I also want to challenge all of us to think about how we can intentionally cultivate more of it and make the choice daily to do that, as opposed to sort of assuming that it's, our dominant paradigm. It's something we have to cultivate. I think we have to remember that we actually, in inviting more and more people into a collaborative process, we generate more goodness. We generate abundance. And so we have to, when I say invite love into the economic paradigm, what I mean by that is a genuine concern for the well-being of the other. And the well-being of the other is contingent also on their ability to contribute. Not just receive, but also contribute to the greater good and to our common life. And so what can we do in our workplaces and in the businesses that we're building to ensure that people become part of this collaborative, co-generative mode of doing things? I think it's made up of a series of small intentional choices every day. So again, it's part of this I think big shift in human history, where we are increasingly recognizing that none of us actually go about any day as a homo economicus. None of us make a continuous set of decisions that are entirely in our self-interest. It's a false paradigm. These entrepreneurs would call this an experience of providence. So this idea that of free gift and exchange, what you give, you get, and that there's this virtual cycle of gift. And if we start to think of our business and capital resources through a lens of abundance, rather than a lens of scarcity, then I think we will open ourselves up to these encounters in this experience of virtuous gift that will completely change and revolutionize how we make our business decisions and how our businesses develop and thrive. A lot of people will say, well, these are small companies in the economy of communion, which is absolutely true. And I think of these companies as sort of agitators on the edges. They're trying to challenge the status quo, the dominant paradigm of how things get done. And if we can start to influence our larger institutions to make decisions a little differently, then we can really change how resources get allocated. The idea of provenance rests on this notion of abundance. So as an entrepreneur, if you are making these radical decisions that are motivated by love, then often you have to recognize that you're inviting providence into the life of your business. And when I say providence, I mean, again, that mutual exchange of gift. So what you give, you receive. There is this continuous exchange, and it goes well beyond the walls of your business. It involves many different actors, seen and unseen, that contribute ultimately to the sustainability and the work of your business. So again, it rests on seeing our economy through a lens of abundance, which is a big shift. The idea that there's enough, there's more than enough. It's not just a question of coming up with a formula for how we're going to distribute that abundant wealth or the abundance. It's about being in relationship and understanding the needs of the other and of myself, and inviting into the life of a business that unexpected providence to meet those needs. And so it has a lot to do, it's best illustrated through the stories of economy of communion entrepreneurs who share these experiences of unexpected jobs, clients, hiring referrals that come right at the perfect moment when the need is very evident and is essentially can be experienced as nothing other than gift. It's received as a gift. It's the idea of an abundant universe that takes care of us.